Wewe simamisha hizo gari. Tunapita hapa. Akikuja hapa mbele. Wewe acha bana. Wewe kama huna reli. Inua juu. Hapo. Asante. Kazi ni mzuri. Wewe acheni akuje hapa mbele bana. Yes, no. Wanaenda kupanga laini hapo. Kupigwa picha hapo juu. Utamwambia yatakuja bado. Mtu atakuja saa ya kutoka. Huyo anaitwa Kashohi. Serikali imebadilika. Si watu. Haibaya Kashohi.
Okay. Yes, planning when we prepare. Yeah, we also sure to keep social distance.
Hiyo ni kawaida. Yo, ni wanaume wale wengine. Hapa bila picha. Kama hiyo drone unaona kama inaenda juu.
Ya kwa kama center park. Tunapata.
Nani?
Hapa center park.
And then we have the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury with his entire team. We can see the Principal Secretary as well as the Administrative Secretary for the Cabinet there. That is the moment that, of course, we are looking at building into the budget, which should be tabled any time from now at the National Assembly. Of course, this budget comes against the backdrop of extremely extraordinary circumstances, and many are questioning how the country will be able to raise some of the targets it has set for itself by way of revenues. And of course, the Budget and Appropriations Committee has indicated in its numbers that there's a targeted borrowing, both domestic and external, at about 823 billion shillings, which of course we'll be delving into in our discussion in studio. Many questioning whether this is something we should be taking on at this particular point, because we have been under immense pressure to seek more debt relief in light of the situation. And the budget books from the National Treasury further indicating that in the coming financial year we'll be having about 900 billion shillings in debt servicing obligations by way of redemptions and interest. So a very dicey conversation there with regard to debt sustainability and Kenya's fiscal consolidation path, which simply means that the government should try and rationalize its expenditure and ensure that it is living within its means. So this is a day that begins a very crucial process in terms of financing the next financial year, which runs between July 2020 and June 2021. Of course, this budget cycle has been unique in its own sense. Never before have we seen the finance bill already being debated in the floor of the House right before even the budget statement is tabled. But this came against an environment where last year we had a bit of push and pull, and there was almost delay in terms of how fast that bill could have been passed. Last year, again, in the financial year, we had a bit of strife regarding the Division of Revenue bill, which saw the Senate against the National Assembly with regard to allocations. So these are issues which the budget cycle in this year has really tried to streamline to ensure that there's no delay in terms of the planned expenditure. And of course, this is an environment where there is need for stimulus within the economy. I should remind you that the March 2020 stimulus aggregates to about 32 billion shillings. Now the government has announced another 53.7, which it terms as post-COVID stimulus package. That takes it aggregate to about close to about 90 billion shillings. But just coming back to studio where we have Fred Omondi. Fred, when you look at the budget cycle this year, unique in its own sense, as I've said, we haven't had the finance bill ever coming before as early as we have seen it this year. Do you think this has done anything to streamline the process, or it's just the same as it was?
In terms of the advantage of that is that previously, if you remember, we had controversy around when some of the budget measures took effect, and Bwana Omkia Mtata actually went to court and managed to stop some of the measures because the date that had been pronounced during the budget statement came before the actual process of debate and assent to the bill had been completed. So in terms of making the process work in a better way, we think it's good for the measures to be released in advance, and so that the public can have sufficient time for input, Parliament can have sufficient time to interrogate them, and probably take in the relevant changes, and then there is time to then pass it through the parliamentary process, have it assented to in good time before the measures actually take effect. Because what used to happen in the past was, those of us who have been following this can recall, was that the measures were announced, let's say today, and then they were effective midnight. So if you needed even to change your systems as a business, then that was really problematic. Well, some of the measures, the businesses were given some time, but then you found when there is a radical change, it still takes time to even change your systems or to be able to prepare to actually implement the new taxes. So we think this is positive in that sense. However, it could also have been informed by the fact that a number of the changes had already come earlier through the Tax Laws Amendment Act, which was in response to the impact of COVID. And therefore, we do not expect a lot of changes in the current budget in terms of taxation. Yes, there are some new measures that have been proposed. And interestingly, some of the measures that were rejected at the tax laws amendment stage have been reintroduced. So I'll be keen to see how Parliament handles that, because it really sends the wrong picture that they didn't know what they were doing when they rejected them, and the Treasury has put them right back in. So we think that should be relooked at, and Parliament should maybe take a firm stance on that. So that would be my take on the process.
But Fred, and still on this matter of some of the measures which were rejected by Parliament, clearly we have observed they've actually been reintroduced with regard to this. And when I was interviewing the Treasury Cabinet Secretary about 2 weeks ago, he did indicate to me that Kenyans need to be pragmatic with themselves and appreciate that these are not ordinary circumstances. Surely there must be a way of raising revenue in spite of the circumstances. A proposal, for example, like taxation of the senior citizens, which has been very controversial. Where else do you think the government could source for revenue? Or maybe should I ask, rationalize its expenditure? Because clearly it is with its backs against the wall.
Yeah, thanks. So even though the government is a big system, and we all know how huge the government is, but the basic principles that apply to you as an individual, to a business, also do apply to the government. So what we are saying is, if you have a certain income, and maybe you see that income is going to be reduced, then what are your options, So as an individual, I think the first step you'd think about is, where can I reduce my expenditure? Where can I cut back on my expenditure? So the same question the government should then be looking at, where can we reduce expenditure? Where can we cut expenditure? And some areas are obvious in the current environment. For example, nobody's traveling. So some of these travels and benchmarking tours, as we know them, some of those could be, cut back significantly, because it won't impact really the day-to-day operations of the government. There are other areas of possible, wastages or leakages that could be reduced. So you start by, trying to cut back on your expenditure. Of course, the other option, which is more controversial given the situation we are in, and it's an interesting analogy, because with COVID-19, we all know that if you have pre-existing conditions, then you'll even be impacted much harder by the disease. So in terms of our own situation, we had some pre-existing conditions. One being, the high level of debt.
Yes.
So in terms of having an option to borrow more, maybe that will be not as feasible as it would have been if our debt levels were a little bit lower. So that is one of the options still. You've seen the IMF extending, additional credit to the government to try and address the immediate challenges and to support budget implementation. So it could be that, there'll be some additional borrowing that they'll then use to plug in the deficit. But as we know, that has to be weighed against the debt sustainability, because when you borrow more, you are simply pushing the can down the road.
Yes.
And you and I will have to pay back in future one way or the other, and debt payment is already taking up a big part of our budget allocation, or even our revenue, as it were. So that is one of the other options, as a business or even as institutions, when we are faced with hard times, we also restructure certain of our operations. So one of the things I would be hoping, and I know it's a topic that is now quite current, is as we go into the constitutional debate, for example, can we look at how to restructure the structure of government in a way that could save us some costs? Because many have asked, whether do we need all the 42 counties, for example?
47.
Yeah, 47, sorry, for example, So there are certain ways we need to look at how could we probably restructure the government for more efficiency to save us on some of these costs. And these are hard decisions, so they are not definitely things that, are easy to do. But I guess the current circumstances then call us to look at things beyond the ordinary to be able to survive, but also set up ourselves for better growth in the future.
I see. And Fred, suppose that you were the cabinet secretary and you were in Ukur Yatani's shoes at this particular point. What sort of balance would be going on through your mind by way of balancing revenue and expenditure? I'm just trying to imagine if you were in that situation, what, for example, would be your priorities?
So it's to focus on things that will relieve taxpayers, businesses of the immediate pain, and things that are a priority for the government and the country as a whole. Of course, top on everybody's mind is health. I mean, the pandemic has taught us that we have to be prepared. We have to have a system that works in case, for everybody when we need it. So investment in health will be a priority for sure. Investment in food security and mitigating the impact on the most vulnerable, and the government is already doing some of this. So I'm not saying they're not doing it. We've seen that they're saying that they'll increase the amount of subsidies that they send to the vulnerable households. The Ministry of Labour has already identified some of the people who've lost their jobs who could potentially be receiving some of these subsidies from the government. So focus on those priority expenditure and cut back on anything that is not high priority at the moment. Of course, everything can be a priority, but then you have to see what is the immediate need. So one area which is likely to suffer, maybe debatable what the impact of that will be in the long term, but one area which is likely to suffer is capital expenditure. So we are likely to see cutback in terms of capital projects, significant projects that like roads or other major projects that would otherwise have been in the program. But still, even these should not be shut down completely, because there are certain frameworks which have been put in place, like PPP, public-private partnership, that could still be used to be able to undertake some of those projects. But that is likely to suffer in the short term as the minister tries to balance the gap. One other measure which is probably not written in the text of the law, but is an administrative measure, is we are likely to see the Revenue Authority being more aggressive in terms of everybody complying with their tax obligations in a bid to be able to raise more revenue. So all taxpayers should expect that they'll be seeing the Revenue Authority knocking more aggressively on their doors, seeking for them to pay up, whatever is due to the exchequer.
I see. Yeah. And I'm told Muthoni is back. Muthoni, if you can hear me, moving on to the subject of debt, of course, the numbers are quite high when you look at the debt servicing obligations we have in the next financial year. Do you see there is ample room for Kenya to go back to the negotiating table with its creditors to try and seek some relief in the coming financial year?
Yes, I think it would be foolhardy not to start negotiating for both the restructuring as well as maybe much more fundamental changes including the debt being forgiven. I know there are certain reasons why the minister said we have not approached that, and part of it is because of our category, I think being an MIC. rather than at the bottom of the poorest countries. But I think there is room for that negotiation. But the first stage is the restructuring. And then remembering that even restructuring means the debt finally will have to be paid. And the real issue we have is the issue of the GDP. Because the GDP growth is not able to do the things we want done. One would be able to afford those large infrastructure projects, as well as to move people from poverty or to get to a better income. And I think originally the target was to have a double-digit growth in GDP. And this is not an impossible task. I think we got to 8 point something somewhere in the last 6-7 years. So to get the other 2% would be quite easy, because we do have some industries, for example, agriculture, which is has some very many, low fruits. For example, if we reduce the post-harvest losses, we'd probably boost our GDP by one. If we manage to produce the basic foods that we're importing, we'd do another 3-4%. So essentially, if we should focus on the things which can grow our GDP, and the selection of the Agenda 4 items, especially the issue of agriculture and manufacturing, that is a beginning point, because we really have not scratched those industries in terms of contribution to GDP. And then there is the issue of tourism. Tourism seems to get very little incentive. Even now, the allocation for the stimulus is very low, and yet it's an industry which has a very high potential. I think the contribution last year was like 163 billion. It was the second highest foreign exchange bringer into the country. Yes. And just a small investment in that, particularly in marketing and supporting the service which we have here, they would give us another maybe 10-20% in the industry, and maybe a contribution of 4% to the GDP. Thank you.
Muthoni, thank you for that. And just to take you back to our live pictures where the CS for National Treasury, Ukur Yatani, has arrived in Parliament, and you can see him there with the Majority Leader, Eden Duale, and other legislators as well. At this point, I'd like to hand you over to my colleague, Alex Mwangi, who's on the ground, to at least give us a sense of how it will be progressing beyond this point. Alex, if you can hear me, what do we expect beyond this? Yes, you can see CS Ukur Yatani there with the chairperson, the outgoing chairperson, I should say, there for the Budget and Appropriations Committee. That is the Kikuyu Member of Parliament, Kimani Ichung'wah, who last week on Thursday tabled the Budget and Appropriations Committee on some of the estimates which had been submitted by the National Treasury, and giving feedback, and largely on a very conservative tone, telling the National Treasury that some of their targets were indeed over-ambitious, especially in light of the situation that we are facing presently. The Budget and Appropriations Committee also interestingly proposed that the management of the COVID-19 Emergency Fund be taken away from the National Treasury and be placed under the National Assembly, and this is cited as a need for more oversight as far as how these funds are deployed, and therefore we wait to see whether some of the feedback that was given by this committee is indeed incorporated in the budget statement, which should be tabled shortly. Alex Mwangi, if you can hear me, what do we expect beyond this point?
Okay, beyond this point, they just been taking the customized photographs with the leaders of either budget committee or the leader of the majority and the minority. And from here, we expect that the CS will walk right into Parliament as he is actually doing just now. And in a few minutes, then we expect that he's going to begin reading the budget, and it's first ever budget that is going to read during a pandemic, making it a unique situation, because even the coverage of this budget is quite different from what we normally do. And right now, the CS is entering the accompanied by other officials, other officials of the government in advance.
And I apologize rather for the quality of that audio. We'll be getting back to Alex as and when we can get him in a more clear sense. But shortly, we'll be expecting some action on the floor of the House. As you can see on your screens, this seems to be the last preparations just before the members walk in, as well as the Cabinet Secretary, are ready to table the budget for the financial year 2020-2021. But coming back to studio, and Fred, Muthoni had already touched on this subject of debt, and I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are. Of course, the Treasury has expressed concern that should it now go and seek some debt relief, it is likely to hurt Kenya's credit ratings. But from where I sit, already an agency such as Moody's has downgraded Kenya.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
You're right. So the issue of debt is one that is continuing to receive a lot of attention because there's a lot of concern as to whether our debt is sustainable. Of course, opinion is divided, and the minister and the treasury is confident that our debt levels are still sustainable, and comparisons have been made, to some developed economies like Japan, the US, and other countries. So yes, it's a question of circumstances again. So the absolute percentages may indicate that we are still within the sustainability range. But I think the issue then is